Yeah, I think we can Zoom people. You can hear us already.
I can hear. Can you hear me when?
Yeah, we can hear you good.
Great. Okay, perfect.
Now, is there a live audience or is this all on Zoom?
There's a live audience. Yeah.
So it's both on Zoom and a live audience.
Yeah. It's hybrid. Yeah. There's.
Whoa. Okay.
Certainly a project Marx himself devoted a lot of time to do. So here we are trying to understand the world as part of our effort to change it. What we're trying to do with political education is develop an engaged, active understanding of this world, social world we live in, to deepen our understanding of theory and history, and of the structures that shape our consciousness and our activities in ways that will give us confidence and make us better activists. And we hope develop social bonds among us as well, make us an organization of true comrades. Something that COVID certainly tested in the last few years, but we hope we can repair a lot of those bonds that seem to have frayed somewhat. Night School has become the flagship activity of New York City DSA's political education project. Great program. We're looking at the history of socialism and socialists in the US. You often hear it said that socialism is a foreign import, un-American even. But as the first three sessions of Socialists of American Spring have shown us, and as tonight's session will continue to do so, this is deeply untrue. Although we may not have the mass socialist parties and pervasive consciousness that's been seen in other places, we certainly have plenty of ancestors to learn from and be proud of, and to inspire us today. Tonight, we'll be looking at the 1930s, era of economic depression that saw some of the most vigorous socialist thinking and organizing in US history. Guiding us will be two of my colleagues in the Political Education Committee, Ben Davis and Lee Ornati. Lee, that's there. And we'll also be joined by a distinguished guest speaker, Mark Naison, who will be coming to us via Zoom. Lee Ornati got involved in left politics with the anti-war and student movements in the 1960s, like SDS and the New Communist Movement. He worked for years in the printing industry and was owner of Teddy's Bar in Williamsburg for 27 years, yeah, decades. Ben Davis is an art critic. He's been on the National Critic for ArtNet News and is the author of two books published by Haymarket, 9.5 Theses in Art. Curious what happened to the other half thesis. And class that was in 2019, and also Art in the Afterculture, which was published last year. And our remote guest, Mark Naison, is a professor of history and African American studies at Fordham. He's been involved in radical politics for over 50 years. He joined the Congress of Racial Equality Corps in 1962, where he worked as a tenant organizer in Harlem. He's been politically active ever since. He's the founder of the Bronx African American History Project, an oral history project that has brought its research into school and cultural organizations throughout that borough. As a writer, he's best known for his 1984 book, Communists in Harlem During the Depression, which I gather you'll draw for tonight's observations. So thanks for coming, and let me introduce Lee Ornati.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I have a slideshow that has a lot of text, but we don't have that much time, so we're going to move right through it. I've summarized the text, and what we're going to move on. People want to get the text later, they can, but we have to move along. So capitalism is in a constant state of crisis. This the period between World War I and World War II shows that tremendously. We're going to trace the economic and political events of that period that shaped the class struggle. Next slide. All right, so during World War I, the Spanish flu, as they called it, epidemic, killed 50 million people worldwide. In the US, it led to a stock market crash and a severe recession. So the ex-servicemen who returned had a lot to do with shaping this period. They sincerely believed that they had fought to make the world safe for democracy. And when they came back and found themselves often injured, without jobs or health care, particularly Black soldiers. This mistreatment went on through the period, which ended in the bonus march, where 43,000 people demonstrated living in shacks in DC. Hoover responded to them, to their encampment, using tanks and tear gas. Black workers who had been courted to join the army, see, this is a recruiting poster from the period, very serene looking, They faced discrimination in the army and came back to no jobs and more discrimination and violence, leading to full-fledged bloody racial massacres in 26 cities. In Arkansas, hundreds of sharecroppers were killed. Many leaders of the civil rights movement started from this period. So, 1919 marked major strikes in meatpacking and steel, which we've discussed before, and were crushed by the Palmer raids and the Red Scare. The women's movement finally had some results. They had been bypassed for many years after World War I. They finally passed the 19th Amendment in 1920. Next slide. So after an initial recession in the 22 to 29 period, the US grew into its world position. The World War I imperialist bloodbath to redivide the world left the US, who had been a late entrant, to come out ahead. The reactionary peace damaged Europe and favored the US financially. Europe had been devastated by war and needed US products and agriculture to grow. The US then pushed to seize oil in South America and cement its imperialist position worldwide. Next slide. So then came a period of fast growth, the Roaring 20s, 1922 to 29. Domestically, the US grew from technical advances and heavy capital investment. Automobile ownership tripled. The nation became electrified. Many bought refrigerators, radios, appliances on credit. Get-rich schemes abounded. In Florida, there was a speculative land boom where they sold land at 10% down. It grew and grew, eventually selling land in the swamps and finally selling land that didn't even exist. The land boom eventually collapsed in 1926, which was a precursor to the next period of the Great Depression. So, okay, the period was characterized by speculation. In the 20s, there were scams abound. The ruling class deregulated, cut taxes, sold stock on margin as low as 10%, and developed a giant market bubble. The tremendous growth in the period, yet 60% lived below subsistence levels. Next one. So culturally, this whole period, 1912 to 1932, was right-wing cultural period, right-wing dominance. Culturally and politically, the country glorified profits and the rich. In 1915, the Hollywood film Birth of a Nation helped the Klan grow. The Klan grew till almost 5 million members. That was mostly in the North. It took over many state houses and newspapers. It is claimed that President Warren G. Harding was initiated to the Klan in a secret ceremony inside the White House in this period. The 1924 Democratic Convention came to a deadlock when there was an openly Klan candidate looking to be the Democratic candidate. It was a deadlock, and a compromise candidate, John Davis, who lost, was put in. So, Prohibition had a similar effect. Prohibition came in widely supported, passed overwhelmingly with an appeal to moralism. As soon as it passed, it was widely flaunted. Everybody realized right away that it was ridiculous. But it found a partner in the Klan. The religious and moral groups of the Prohibition and the Klan had reason to attack religious and moral, reason to attack labor immigrants, African American, Jews, and sects of any kind. And there's a poster from the IWW opposing the Klan in the period. Next slide. The Scopes trial was a big cultural event in the period. Teacher had been jailed for teaching evolution. And it was a big show trial that went out over the radio, which everybody had at this point. This was the beginning of when everybody had radio. Clarence Darrow for the ACLU versus populist, three-time Democratic presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan. After a long trial, a guilty verdict came in 9 minutes. The whole country watched. Oops. Next slide. The stock market crashed, 1929. So by midsummer, 300 million shares were sold on margin. The stock market was in a giant bubble. The end of October, within a few days, the balloon burst. Mid-November, the stock market was at 50% of its value. Banks and companies had stopped investing in production and were only speculating. They speculated not only with the profits, but with the proceeds. The bank run. So there proceeded to be a series of bank runs, similar to the one we almost had a few days ago. But there was four different series of bank runs going through 1930, 31, and 32. There was an example of one, a small merchant in the Bronx went to a branch of the Bank of the United States. I'm actually reading it from that this time. And asked to sell his stock. When told the stock was no good, he left the bank and spread a rumor. And within hours, 2,500 to 3,500 depositors withdrew a total of 2 million in funds. You know, of course, these banks had invested in dubious propositions. They were totally not liquid. And by the end of the period, over 9,000 banks had failed. One of the dubious policies was they counted checks twice. There was a check that had been sent from one bank to another, sending bank counted it, and the receiving bank counted it. So when the crash came, they had no money. Next slide. So what were the damages? Real GDP fell 29%. World trade collapsed due to bank issues and protectionism and tariffs. Unemployment went to 25%. Prices fell 27%. 9,000 banks failed. Most depositors lost all their money. Agriculture collapsed, creating a dust bowl. Farming at the end of World War I had been mechanized to feed the soldiers in Europe. When soldiers and Europe, when that market went away, overproduction caused collapse of prices, and rural America took no part in the 20s expansion. Low prices led to more planting and still lower prices. All in all, 750,000 farms went bankrupt. The unplanted and deserted farms, together with the drought, created the dust bowl, because everything was just left out. So Roosevelt, so the crash happened 6 months before Hoover's inauguration. So he had 4 years after the crash where he was still the president. His response was to double down on policies of deregulation, tax cuts, and calling for individual responsibility. It was a total disaster. Roosevelt won overwhelmingly. He was the first Democrat in 80 years to both win the popular and the representative count, first one since the Civil War. But he got only 24% of the black votes because most blacks still thought Republicans were their people. Roosevelt immediately instituted programs, and we have a list of them there: the civil conservation, public works progress, but they had little effect immediately. So there was a lot of financial report. The financial system had totally been decimated. Nobody knew where to put their money. If they had money, the banks didn't work. So they instituted a bunch of reforms, which basically are still what we have today, but had little effect. Took a while, but finally there was some effect. So those are the conditions under which the class struggle was fought through this period. Through periods of bust, boom, and bust cycles. Socialists, who were the only resolute supporters of the poor and working class, waged the class struggle through the period. Sometimes fighting alone because there were no allies, sometimes uniting with others and changing their policies as the class forces and world situation change. So what we're gonna hear about in our presentation is what were the lessons from that experience. Thank you.
Do you want me to start talking now?
We're gonna bring you up 1 second.
Perfect.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Mark?
Yes.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I am going to talk completely differently than the prior presentation, because my presentation is going to be about how a group of socialists in America were forced to confront anti-Blackness. And it didn't come organically. It didn't come naturally. It came through Soviet influence on the Communist International in response to Black radicals going to the Soviet Union, meeting with revolutionaries around the world, and telling them that American socialists were hopelessly corrupted by white chauvinism. And the reason this is, it's both tragic and
Mark, we're having some audio problems. We just. Okay, just get into it. Can you hear us, Mark?
Can you hear me?
Now we can. We lost you for a second.
I'll make it as loud as I can. That at the dawn of the Depression, the Communist International ordered the CPUSA to make fighting white chauvinism as much a priority as the class struggle, and told them there was no hope of the American working class rising up to improve its conditions, much less take power, unless white communists fought white chauvinism in their movement as well as in the society. And there's one quote from a resolution of the Communist International on what they call the Negro question at the dawn of the Depression, which has always stuck with me. and remained a personal credo. It is the duty of the white communist to strike the 100% white chauvinist in the face. I'll repeat it, it's the duty of the white communist to strike the 100% chauvinist who attacks a Negro in the face. You couldn't just passively resist anti-Blackness. You had to fight it as the precondition of creating a mass movement. And it's because of this position that had to be proven in action that Black leaders and Black working class people started gravitating to the Communist Party in the
Video just dropped again. Can you hear us?
You cut the video for a little bit.
I did.
was white communists had to prove that they were reliable allies of Black people, not in words, but in deeds. And there were two ways that ended up having an impact in Harlem on the broader community, actually three. The first was when white communists were put on trial for what was called white chauvinism, for acts of insensitivity towards Black people in communist organizations. So a Finnish janitor, because there was a significant Finnish communist community in East Harlem in 1931, was put on trial for acts of white chauvinism. His name was August Jokinen. And 2,000 people attended this trial in Harlem as a way of demonstrating that the Communist Party was serious about uprooting racism in its own ranks. Secondly, the Communist Party began advertising interracial dances to show that it totally rejected the taboos towards interracial sociability that were even there among socialists and liberals. Socialists often said, we support legal equality, but we don't support social equality. And social equality meant social interaction and intermarriage among Blacks and whites. The Communist Party was the first socialist organization to openly argue that if you were fighting racism, you had to support intermarriage between Blacks and whites.
Mark, we lost your audio again, if you can hear us.
It's just the internet.
Yeah, that's what it says.
Can we do a hotspot?
Why don't we just not
That's a good
see
idea.
his face and make it radio?
Mark, is there any way you could turn your video off?
Turn my video.
But if it's our internet, should we do a hotspot?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, I turned my video off. Is it better?
Okay,
Yeah.
That's not gonna cure the internet putting up.
yeah, apparently the Zoom people can hear it fine, so it's the.
Do you,
Shit. Should I keep talking?
just give us 1 second, Mark.
We can hear you clearly now. If you cut out again, I'll let you know.
Okay, my video's off. You don't need to see me anyway.
You can go ahead.
Okay, but those are the symbolic gestures, the August Jokinen trial and the interracial dances. And by the way, groups like the Duke Ellington Band played at these interracial dances in Harlem. They were big events. But the two most important movements that made it clear that whites were effective allies of Black people were the movement to free the Scottsboro Boys and eviction. shameful.
Just one more second, Mark.
Maybe you should tell him though where they cut off, because I think we.
Rails into depression. And the Communist Party came in, not only undertook their legal defense, but organized a global movement to free the Scottsboro Boys. And so you had Free the Scottsboro Boys marches in Harlem, where the Communist Party was able to draw 2,000 white communists, mostly out of the Bronx, to march through the streets of Harlem chanting, "Free the Scottsboro Boys, end legal lynching." Nobody in Harlem or anywhere else had ever seen anything like that before. And it reinforced the argument that there are white people who will go to a wall for Black people in fighting for justice, and are then you can be people you can unite with in class struggle for unemployment insurance, to build unions, to fight for a greater share of national income. But the whole argument that was made by groups like Marcus, the Garvey movement, was you can never trust white people, and the white socialists are the worst. They'll betray you in the end. So the communist argument was the only way to fight that is to show that white people were willing to fight for racial justice and even risk their own safety in doing so. And that's where the eviction protest came in. In the end of 1931, the Communist Party decided that the best way to deal with the homeless crisis in New York City, which was worsening and worsening, was to get groups of communists to put back the furniture of families who had been evicted, and then urge the rest of the neighborhood to occupy the building and prevent marshals from putting the furniture back. So the biggest of these rent strikes were in the Bronx, and some of them involved 4,000 people fighting police and marshals. But in Harlem, you had groups of Black and white communists doing this, and people in the community watched white communists get beaten and jailed to put the furniture of Black people back in their apartment. No one had ever seen anything like this before. And so, and no socialist movement had ever done this, because no socialist movement had said that you had to fight racism in order to fight capitalism, and that the responsibility of fighting racism fell largely upon whites. The argument they made to Black communists was,
Mark, we lost you again.
in the 1930s, this is what is going on in the Communist Party in Harlem. And you're winning over some Black nationalist leaders like Audley Moore, a brilliant Garveyite organizer who became a communist, but you're also starting to win over members of the Black middle class. And here, the local communists are expanding the Comintern line and creating much broader coalitions than the Comintern was calling for. In particular, coalitions with Black churches and Black fraternal organizations. Have any of you ever heard of the Divine Nine? Okay, those are the great African-American fraternities and sororities. They were very influential in shaping the Black middle class in America, and still are today. The several communist leaders came from Black middle class backgrounds and were college educated. And as the communist movement started crossing racial lines in fighting the Scottsboro case and in the unemployed movement, you began to have Black middle-class leaders of the Communist Party began to create coalitions with important Black ministers and also with leading writers and intellectuals. So someone like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the most influential Black minister in Harlem, became an ally of the communists. There was one of the most influential leaders of the Communist Party in Harlem was Louise Thompson, who later became Louise Thompson Patterson, married William Patterson, a brilliant communist lawyer. She had a salon in the Sugar Hill section of Harlem, where a number of leading Black writers and theatrical people and poets gravitated to. So what you had in the Communist Party in Harlem was you had a sort of grassroots working class mobilization that drew upon the Garvey movement, and you also to the Communist Party. And if you know, the three most important cultural figures of that time, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Paul Robeson, were all part of that artistic intelligentsia that was close to the Communist Party. Now, a lot of this happened initially against, stretching the Comintern mandate, because the communists in Harlem, the alliances they were creating were much broader than what the third period, ultra-militant line called for. But then in 1935, when the Popular Front emerged, then these alliances became incredibly broad and incredibly effective. And involved, an incredible array of Harlem churches, fraternal organizations, and even for a period, the largest Black union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And the way communists operated in these worlds, it's something that I remained with me for the rest of my life in my own organizing. In the Popular Front period, communists did not always publicly identify themselves in mass movements they participated in. They pushed for the broadest possibly acceptable policies that moved in the direction of pro-civil rights, pro-unions, and pro-distribution of wealth. But the communists did not overtly push socialism. They did it privately. And this is so one of the things that made the Communist Party effective, though also problematical, is there were two levels of a party in mass organizations. You had people who participated in, let's say, the National Negro Congress, the Transit Workers Union, or the Union of WPA Workers, or what later became AFSCME, civil service unions, and they were leaders publicly without openly pushing socialism, but privately both met with other communists and recruited people to join them in the following way. If somebody was showing, a high level of militancy and energy, they would tap them on the shoulder and say, do you want to be with the true fighters for the working class and for racial justice? We have an organization that will help you do this. But you have to keep it secret. And this was a brilliant tactic, especially in organizing unions where employers had spies. And by the way, you know, two of the most successful labor campaigns that I know of, the Flint sit-down strikes and the organization of the Transport Workers Union in New York City, you were facing employers who had armies of infiltrators and spies. So you couldn't publicly identify yourself. So you had secret organizations that operated, and some of them were connected to the immigrant groups that were concentrated there. In the Transport Workers Union, you had a lot of exiles from the Irish Civil War in groups like Clan na Gael, if any of you have heard of it. Michael Quill, the great leader of the Transport Workers Union, was the MC at Clan na Gael dances in the Bronx. He had a whole following. So when the communist cadre in the Transport Union, and some of them were Finns who gave themselves Irish names, when they brought in Michael Quill, they brought in a whole network, secret network, because you couldn't fight, you know, you couldn't fight the Irish Civil War in a public organization, could you? The British would kill you. So you were already dealing with people who knew how to work clandestinely. And then in Flint, you had the Eastern European communist ethnic organizations, which you worked through, which the spies couldn't infiltrate because they didn't speak the European languages. So it's a fascinating strategy of two levels of work. But it also meant that, you know, you fought for broader principles, but you didn't do socialist education publicly. You only did it privately. But, you know, as a result of this, the Communist Party played an incredible role in building the industrial labor movement in the United States, including in New York City. And they also got the industrial labor movement to completely nullify the racial hierarchies that most of the AFL unions, you know, the majority of AFL unions had white-only clauses. And that included the machinists, the railway workers, even some of the skilled trades in steel and auto. The CIO, where communists operated within, there were no color bars to membership in any of those unions. There were problems. There was constant racial tension, but the CP managed to help build an industrial labor movement. And they also, the other thing they did, they pushed liberals to the left on race, because you know, the Communist Party emphasized culture, theater, literature, music. And the message was that, and nobody presented this more than Paul Robeson, that African people and African Americans were responsible not only for building
That's all.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but what?
You're back. Yeah, now we can.
Oh, shit. Okay. Anyway, they were organized.
You're talking about Paul Robeson.
Okay, Paul Robeson, when he came back to the United States, made the argument that Black labor, not only did Black labor create the basis of the American economy, but that Black people's cultural contributions were at the absolute center of what made American music and American culture globally popular. So this is what you had by the late 30s. You had an organization which, by taking a position on race that no other socialist organization had ever taken, had managed to create interracial coalitions, fighting for racial justice, fighting against lynching, fighting against Jim Crow, had managed to break a lot of racial barriers in the labor movement, and also had begun to make the argument that Black culture is central to American culture. Now, the tragedy is that the Communist Party would never have taken that position had not the Communist International pushed them to take it. I would like to say that this was organic to the American movement. It absolutely wasn't. But that meant you had a debt to the Soviet Union. So if the Soviet Union signs a pact with Nazi Germany, the people who had traveled with it this far were pretty much going to stay with it, even though it would break up a lot of their coalitions. But in other words, what I'm saying is the devil's bargain, which made the Communist Party so effective in challenging American racism, also would ultimately doom it. But the people who had gone through that communist experience, even though they were sometimes traumatized, would continue in later years to bring that education on race into everything they did. And one of the things that I was lucky enough to interview a lot of people who were involved in the Communist Party. And one of them said to me, this was a white communist, what began as a Comintern order became a moral imperative that we internalized. Because we realized that this approach to race was the only thing that could work in America. And I would say it worked then, it works now. Thank you.
We have time for some questions from Mark, and I think we should ask those questions now while we have him here, because it's a little bit.
I think Mark can turn his camera on too, because that's not the issue.
Yeah, we can go ahead and we can turn him on. Can you still hear us, Mark?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm sorry.
It's not your fault.
It's our internet.
Yeah, absolutely not you. But if people have questions, things that they missed, or just questions that come up from Mark, I think he's generously giving us his time for people to tease out some of the nuances where he left off, some of the nuances for today, and just questions you have about this history. I think that this
You can also email me, and I will answer any questions in email.
I have a question, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
A question mark. It's very interesting about the relationship to the Comintern. I wonder if you could say something about the relationship to Roosevelt and FDR and how that affected the work.
Well, I think that initially the CP saw Roosevelt as a class enemy. That was the position in the early 30s. That changed with the Popular Front line in 1935, when the CP was told in communist parties all over the world, start making alliances with anyone who's anti-fascist. And in the United States, the communist leadership decided that it made no sense to run a candidate against Roosevelt, because Roosevelt could be an ally eventually in containing the rise of fascism, and could also be an ally in building an industrial labor movement. So the CP criticized Roosevelt mildly in its publications, but refused to run candidates against him in the 1936 election, and basically saw him as creating a climate in which the CP could build broad coalitions. It was kind of realizing that given the Popular Front line, they were much better off with Roosevelt as president than any alternative, certainly than any Republican. Because a lot of it had to do, and here the Flint strike is a great example. Here you have, throughout American labor history, one key strike after another was broken when federal troops were sent to break the strike. The 1877 railroad strike, the Pullman strike in the 1890s, the Homestead strike, broken with state militia. And so here you have 1936-37, you know, union organizers in auto led by communists occupy 9 plants in Flint, Michigan, and defend it from attacks by local police and armed vigilantes. Any other time in US history, the president would have sent in troops. Roosevelt refused to do so. The governor sent in the National Guard, but only to keep the peace between the strikers and the armed vigilantes. So, and you know, with the situation, since the president refused to send troops, General Motors decided, let's, you know, to negotiate. We have no choice. And what's amazing is after General Motors settled and recognized the union, US Steel voluntarily did the same thing. So the 2 largest industrial corporations unionized because the president wouldn't send in troops to break an 8-week strike where 9 plants were occupied. Think about that. 9 occupied, unarmed, not armed. So they felt they had a modus vivendi with Roosevelt that was to their advantage, given the international climate and given the US labor history.
We have another question for you.
Yeah.
So following up on this, I understand why the communists took their Popular Front strategy. And I understand, though I didn't know that much of it before, why they adopted the primacy of fighting racism strategy towards building a united working class. But I don't quite understand how they managed the tension between it, since so much of the New Deal policies that were wonderful for white people, whether ended up excluding blacks, so they didn't get a lot of the labor protections, you know, industries like agriculture and domestic work, you know, all those things. That how did they deal with that?
I think they took what they could get, which is that the industrial working class was going to be unionized across the color line. And they chose not to fight a battle they couldn't win with Social Security and minimum wage regarding Southern agriculture and domestic service. I mean, you know, and also there were other things happening in the New Deal, like the Homeowners Loan Corporation, you know, putting Black neighborhoods under unfavorable categories so that they couldn't, you know, landlords couldn't get loans to improve their buildings. There was a lot of policies of the New Deal that reinforced racial hierarchy. And then there were policies of the New Deal which helped shatter it. So, you know, I didn't, there was very little. One of the things about the Communist Party is they didn't exactly focus on issues that might be embarrassing to them. So I, you know, in reading through the communist literature, I saw almost nothing about the exclusion of domestic workers and agricultural workers from key pieces of New Deal legislation.
Black organizers.
You know, so that is problematical. And
I mean,
you're right.
Isn't it also that they were, I mean, in part it's geographical, they were largely focused in the North. I mean, they had a position on Blacks in the South, and obviously that's where the majority of Blacks in the country were, and there are noble exceptions like, you know, what you read in Hammer and Hoe, but I also think it's like you know, you're talking about Harlem, like the concentration of the party was generally in the North, and it seems rational that the issues they were focused on were about advancing the Black struggle and labor movement in the North for that reason.
And the Communist Party did expose the exploitation of domestic workers. You know, there were articles about the Bronx slave market, you know, those shape-up areas in the Bronx where Black women congregated to be picked up. And Marvel Cook was the reporter who, she was very close to the Communist Party, who exposed that. So they you know, selectively in their own domain took on those issues. But I don't want to make it seem like there weren't huge areas of hypocrisy or selective blindness within this movement and opportunism. It's just that compared to every other group in the American radical and socialist tradition, their position on race was far more advanced and more far-reaching. But
We have another question.
Yeah.
It's a super basic question. I just liked one of the lines you said towards the end of your talk. You said something like, in the Communist Party, there's a devil's bargain, which at the same time empowered them against race, but also was destructive. So could you just like flesh out the two sides of that bargain, like, and also similarly short and snappy something?
Okay. Basically, the Communist Party would not have, if the Comintern resolutions in the Negro question hadn't argued in the most forceful terms that the US party make fighting white chauvinism in the movement in the country its major priority, the Communist Party would not have done that. Because no domestic American organization before it ever did that. And so it was the Soviet Comintern influence that pushed them to that position, which then was embraced by many people when they saw the results. But at the same time, okay, if you're a working class person, and not just if you're Black, if you feel like the whole country is against you, and you've been beaten and harassed and, you know, and jailed, and you know people who've been deported, you know people who've been lynched. The idea that you have this powerful country in another part of the world run by people like you, which is going to fight for you, it was very seductive. It gave people courage to fight harder than they would have otherwise fought. And so many communists risked their lives doing what they did. Going down south to organize sharecroppers, going into company towns, which were run by the KKK in many places, or the Black Legion, going into the transit system, where it's filled with spies and goons, you know, putting back the furniture and then being beaten by police and marshals.
But then what about the doom side?
You know, so that knowing that you had this country on your side and this global movement, and that people had gone to the Soviet Union, they met revolutionaries from Vietnam and South Africa and China. This was a very powerful, seductive thing. And so if you told them, you know, there's mass murder there, you don't want to hear it. If you told them that they're willing to sacrifice, just as they're willing to help you, they're also willing to sacrifice you, you don't want to hear it. And so there are various decisions, like when, you know, the Nazi-Soviet pact, or after World War II, when the Soviet Union occupies Eastern Europe and turns, you know, those countries into basically extensions of Soviet influence. Your instinct is, this movement has protected me, it's helped me, we're gonna let that slide. But at a certain point, the things that are being done by the Soviet Union or pushed by the Soviet Union are going to force even your best allies to break with you, which is what happened in 1947 and 48. The two most important allies of the Communist Party in New York City were Adam Clayton Powell and Mike Quill. And they both broke with the CP in 48 over the, you know, opposition to the Marshall Plan and what was going on in Eastern Europe. So, you know, part of me, I spent a lot of time with old communists, sitting and drinking bourbon and beer with them and getting in arguments where they're pounding the table. It's the Soviet people's responsibility to criticize what's going on there, not Americans. That it was very hard for them, even when unconscionable things were being discovered or being done, for people to let go of the movement had made their life meaningful and had given them the courage to do amazing things. It's tough. I mean, I get it, but there was a price to be paid for it. But let's put it this way. I'm glad the Communist International pushed them to do this, because somebody had to make anti-Blackness intolerable in the American socialist movement.
I think we have time for two more questions.
I'll be quick, yeah.
We also have Isaac on stack.
Oh, okay. Okay, well then, two more questions.
Quick question. So I'm interested in the use of the word chauvinism. I'm used to hearing more of a conversation framed around fascism. Can you explain like the relationship between those two terms? Because I feel like it's relevant to what you're saying.
Okay, in the white chauvinism, the intensity of the campaign.
No, cut out. Mark, you're cutting out. I tried.
Remains in the crucial place.
It wasn't meant to be answered yet. Hey, Mark, can you hear us?
Where basically you were trying to make fighting racism and the Black contribution to American life and culture something that everybody would make everybody feel more powerful. In other words, it was more celebratory and less punitive and angry. That's sort of the difference. Now, maybe some people felt that it should have remained angry and punitive because racism was still, but the idea was, let's make everybody celebrate Black people for their contribution to building the country and making its culture so charismatic and beautiful. That the early 30s, we've got to prove to Black people that white people are willing to risk their lives to fight racism. In the late 30s, it's more, we have to celebrate Black contributions to American culture and embrace Black people in all of our activities.
Okay, Isaac, and then up here you'll be our last speaker.
Hi, Mark. This was a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like the role of like the Black Belt thesis and like the like fight for self-determination. What and specifically, like, do you think like it really reads to me like they're kind of like there's an influence there from the Garvey movement?
Yeah,
and like from
that's a really interesting question. I think they developed the Black Belt thesis that there was the potentiality of an independent nation in the South as a way of attracting Garvey movement people into the Communist Party, but also getting communists to go south to organize Black people. And there were a number of communist organizers who went into Alabama to organize an unemployed movement in Birmingham and to try to organize sharecroppers. And
We lost you, Mark, if you can hear us. It is recording.
The abolitionists left the South after Reconstruction, and the communists have come back to finish the job. They saw them as the heirs of the people from the Freedoms Bureau who founded the HBCUs and the schools in the South and helped Black people organize politically, and then were driven out. So even the Black Belt thesis became a vehicle to fight for democracy in Southern states, to fight the poll tax, fight for workers' rights for sharecroppers. Except that trying to do that would get you killed and get you beaten and get you jailed. But a number of communists did exactly that. So, it's funny when here is this movement, which some would say is hierarchical and undemocratic, which probably did much more to bring real democracy to the United States than any movement which claimed to be actually democratic. That's the irony. And the Soviet Union did more to make the United States democratic than it did the Soviet Union.
The last question up here.
Yeah, I guess I'm not necessarily sure I agree with when you say that like they made a deal with the devil. Like the Comintern. I guess my question is like I think like the New Deal was a deal with the devil being American imperialism. And my question is, the Communist Party after they rallied forces within the American working class to support, you know, FDR and the New Deal, whether they had any sort of a critique of the imperialist aspect of this, because the New Deal, from my understanding, brought internal stability, but it allowed FDR to, like, you know, for example, make deals with the Saudis, right? Like, was there any sort of emphasis on anti-imperialism within this?
Ironically, the only emphasis in anti-imperialism came after the Nazi-Soviet pact. And then the Communist International and the CPUSA began to focus on not only British and French imperialism, but US imperialism. But during the Popular Front, that was again selectively left out. So you're absolutely right. There were a lot of things that was selectively left out when you're making, if you're saying the bargain with the devil is with Roosevelt, you know, to build the labor movement, you're overlooking a lot of other things. To build an industrial labor movement. And also to have the United States in general move as close to being anti-fascist as it could be in that situation.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was amazing.
I mean, it's so weird for me to talk about. I haven't talked about this in so long. I'm amazed that I still remember it. But to me, I learned as an organizer from this so much in terms of my life, in terms of working in broad coalitions and, you know, not necessarily letting people know who I was, if that was going to get in the way of the work. And also racism.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And also you can anybody can email me to keep this conversation going. I mean, I'll answer any questions you have or get in any kind of dialogue you want, okay?
What's your email?
Naison I'll put it down. Naison at Fordham. Now I have to watch the Knicks. If anybody knows me, my other life is sports.
Can someone
my real life. Naison at Fordham.edu. Oh, that's for everyone. No, I got to put it. I sent that to Isaac. How do I say everyone? Everyone. Okay, I'll put it down.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Come visit again.
Yes, please come back all the time.
Good having you at the time.
Take care.
Okay, bye.
Okay. Thank you very much for sticking with us. It is
Take your time.
well, we are I'm gonna take basically I'm just gonna say I'm gonna take my full 15 minutes. This is the third part of our thing, my full 20 minutes. I am not hurt if people have to leave. It's a long night, but you're already here. You might as well stick around. I cannot promise to be better than the great Mark Naison. I can't promise not to cut out because I'm right here. And I will tell you that I have envisioned this presentation. If this convinces you to stick around, I've envisioned our cycle of presentations here, kind of on a salad dinner dessert model. You know, that leaves is the greens that you gotta eat beforehand, gotta know is your foundation. Mark is the main course, and mine is the slightly more, hopefully a little bit more fun stuff that you get when you stick around. Because I guess what in and of itself I wanted to do is to talk about the New Deal arts programs in specific. It's a kind of a case study for what was at stake in some of these debates. It's an eccentric thing, but I thought that it's a part of this history that people maybe know. It's a very visible part of leftist history in the United States, but it's also a piece of history that is very mythologized. So I thought that for our purposes, we could maybe like claim some of it for our own as socialists, as actual activists. It's also a very, it's a glamorous part of our history. This is a photo by Dorothy Lang, made a listener from 1935 to introduce it. So first slide, please. So there are the New Deal arts projects, which was the government support for art as part of Roosevelt's New Deal, are a real object, a sentimental object for liberals, lefties of all kinds in the United States. Every time there's actually a financial crisis, people will call for a New Deal for the arts. It is a high point of government support for the arts. Just the New Deal was a high point for government intervention in the economy in general in the United States. But what I want to say is there's a radical piece to this that often gets left out or treated in a kind of like romanticized way, and I want to drill into that. So I want to drill into that a little. Just introducing this subject. This is Charles White, who is probably one of the great social realist painters. Social realist is named for the style of people who set out to paint the reality of living conditions in the United States in a realist style. And he actually cut his teeth he became an artist because of a sit-in by communist organizers in the New Deal art projects in 1937 in Chicago, where they were sitting in for better conditions for all the artists who were on relief, and specifically to integrate the projects, to get more Black artists hired in Chicago. So he has this great quote that I love. My first lesson on the Illinois Art Project dealt not so much with paint as with the role of unions in fighting for the rights of working people. I think that's very inspiring. So here's the first slide after this. So, yeah, this is just his first major mural commission after he became an artist in 1939. Again, a New Deal mural. Next slide. This is a later piece from 1970, and because of his, so it's not really clear if Charles White was ever a member of the Communist Party USA, but he was definitely associated for the entire life on the masthead of a lot of their journals. There's a quote from one of his biographers talking about his relationship with them. It's often something that people try and like write out of his history or treat as something that he moved on from. But I think it's pretty clear that it was a very important part of his formation. And incidentally, the great Harry Belafonte, who just died, actually spoke at his wake, gave the speech at his wake. They were part of the same cultural milieu. And there's on the Museum of Modern Art website from the recent Charles White retrospective, there is a clip, an audio clip that you can listen to of Harry Belafonte speaking about the importance of Charles White's work. Next slide. Here's another example. This is Alice Neal, another very important painter who's recently been very celebrated. She had a very popular survey at the Metropolitan Museum of Art 2 years ago now. Also, somebody who painted in a realist style and was drawn to definitely joined the Communist Party. I love this quote. The first time I joined the Communist Party was about 1936, but I was never a good communist. I hate bureaucracy. Even the meetings used to drive me crazy. I'm sure we can all identify with it to a certain extent, but the Communist Party affected my work quite a bit. Let's go to the next slide. You can really see here, this is a painting from 1936. You can really see, the energy that she got from it. She was inspired by the milieu. Next slide. This is a painting she did from 1951 of Mother Bloor, who was a communist organizer, organized in the Dust Bowl in the Midwest during the 1930s. And I love this quote from Andrew Hemingway from his great book, Artists on the Left. Alice Neal is representative of that type of woman artist, intellectual, who gravitated to the CP because, whatever its limitations, it offered the most sustained critique available of class, racial, and sexual inequality. And I just want to start there, these two examples, because I think people can get really hung up on the kind of like institutional politics of things. And it's important to remember that these were all people who were had different and varied relationship to things. And in some sense, we're just looking for the tools to in some cases, the Communist Party, there were lots of diverse forms of leftism and radicals in the 1930s. In some sense, people were just drawn to what was available to them, found the resources that they needed. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of the New Deal arts projects. This is just a painting by William Sawyer from 1935 that I kept painting after some of the glamour of the scene. Next slide. So let me pause now before I get into it to ask a question about the Popular Front. How many people here have a really strong opinion about the Popular Front? Just out of curiosity. 1, 2, 3. It's just because it is a very hotly contested term in our movement. You know, people have very strong opinions about it, and I'll give you. Actually, does someone here want to try and define what it means to them? Yeah.
Well, it's always meant to mean that the Communist Party subsumed their.
Do you want to stand up?
Yeah, it meant to mean that the Communist Party subsumed their movement for like progressive politics, and it was under the bourgeois parties who were anti-fascist.
Right.
And so they wouldn't. So the Communist parties would not lead. They would work underneath the bourgeois parties who were vaguely to the left.
That's great. Someone have an alternative definition? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that definition, the criticism is sort of built in, the not critical definition, or maybe is that like, because communism was a small minority in the United States, building a broad democratic front to fight fascism and to push the New Deal as far as it could possibly go and the industrial unions as far as they could possibly go was the task of the moment.
But one more thing, I'd like to contextualize what my man felt was criticism. It did come out of the third period, which was criticized as far too left.
Sure.
And so it was in somewhat a direct reaction, you might say, to that. So
yeah, and I think that for people who don't know, I think that gives I think that was great. That gives a little bit of a flavor of some of the debates about the stakes of, you know, the title of this session, which is the New Deal and the Popular Front. Michael Denning, this was one of the extended readings on our thing. He has his book called the Cultural Front, which is great. He defines the Popular Front in a part of his book in a much more broad way. He says, the rank and file of the Popular Front were the fellow travelers, the large periphery. So he's opposing it to the idea of the Popular Front as just a communist party line. But even this terminology is misleading. The periphery was in many cases the center. The fellow travelers were the Popular Front. It is mistaken to see the Popular Front as a marriage of communists and liberals. The heart of the Popular Front as a social movement lay among those who were non-communist socialists and independent leftists, working with communists and with liberals, but marking out a culture that was neither a party nor a liberal New Deal culture. Now you can debate that, and people, I think the institutional definition is very useful, but I do think it's useful to think that there was to people, again, people on the ground living this history. It might not have felt, and as Mark Naison said, you know, people didn't always know who was a communist, who they were, what kind of groups they were. And there was a very broad popular culture that was not liberal and was communist in a broader sense. Michael Denning says the three pillars of what he calls the cultural front of the period were anti-fascism, commitment to industrial unionism, and some form of social democratic politics. Now, I do not have this quote, but I will say that this is in contradiction to the way Mike Davis frames the stakes of the Popular Front in the main text that we did, The Barren Marriage of American Labor and the Democratic Party. On page 60, he says, increasingly uncritical support for Roosevelt also came from the Communist Party, which decked out its new image as 20th century Americanism, took popular frontism to such extremes And he goes on to list some bad alliances they made. And then he concludes by saying the curious result. He talks about, because this is the popular front period, this is the latter half of the 30s, really the Communist Party really grew. But it specifically did not grow, this is Mike Davis's point, not grow, this is Mike Davis's point, amongst the industrial working class. It grew with what he calls second generation workers in the cultural industries. The curious result, he says, was to give the CP a resonance in national politics and hegemony on the left, which was quite unequal since the heyday of the old Socialist Party in 1910, 1912, while at the same time the party was becoming more detached from strong roots in the newly unionized industrial working class. So this is an interesting, I don't know if I want to call it a contradiction, but these are two different sides. Mike Davis is a labor historian. Michael Denning is a cultural historian. One of Michael Denning's point about this period is that the 1930s were a period when not just of industrial militancy, but when culture, the cultural, what he calls the cultural apparatus became a bigger thing. It was when the big Hollywood studios got going, when radio started, when the photo tabloid papers were a big thing. There was an entirely new kind of intellectual workers who identified with a new radicalism and were growing. There was a new kind of cultural mass who were identifying suddenly with left politics. This is when people went from calling themselves clerks to calling themselves office workers at the time, that had the mark of like solidarity to it. Whereas Mike Davis is actually remarking on some of the contradictions of this, that as the party's cultural influence grew in the popular front period, that sort of was sort of a mirage that covered over some of its developing weaknesses in industry. Next slide, please. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths of the New Deal Arts Project. So I talked about kind of sentimental liberal reading of them. And the mythical origin of the New Deal Arts Projects. Roosevelt is elected in 1932, as Lee talked about at the beginning, on the back of tremendous popular unrest, massive unemployment, and actually, violence against veterans in the flats, the swamp flats of Washington, D.C. And with a mandate, he came with a mandate for change, right? So the mythological beginning, the story that's often told about how the New Deal Arts Project begins is that this guy, painter George Biddle, who went to private school with Roosevelt, writes him a letter in the last half of 1933 and says, hey, Roosevelt, the artists are really got your back. They've got this mural revolution going on in Mexico. And the Mexican government has agreed to pay its mural workers, plumbers, wages. I think that if you offer this, it'd be a really good way to get the artists on board with you. So people talk about that as a thing. What I think is interesting about this is that the week that he sends this letter, May 9, 1933, next slide, is the same week of the famous destruction of Diego Rivera's Man of the Crossroads mural in Rockefeller Center. Do people already know this story? I'll tell this story. Diego Rivera, one of the most famous artists of the era, he and a communist, comes to the United States on a tour in the early 1930s to make murals. He's considered this new form of public radical art coming out of the Mexican Revolution. He's commissioned by the Rockefellers to paint this mural of Man at the Crossroads in Rockefeller Center. And at the last minute, he insists on putting this figure of Lenin, horrified the oil magnates who are working for him, who sandblasted and destroyed the mural. This is a big scandal. This is a huge scandal. Sure, that's the next slide. Actually, go 2 slides. Right. The next one. Yeah, this is a big scandal, and out of the activism around that scandal, this group, the Artists Committee for Action, is a free speech group that comes out of the unemployed artist councils that the Communist Party had set up as semi-front groups, comes together, and there's like serious agitation, free speech agitation around this Diego Rivera case that goes on to form the seeds of this artist union. And the artists organized themselves on the basis of an identification as a worker and just protested constantly, protested the museum, protested the College Art Association. And it was that formed a lot of the impetus for the New Deal administration to advance the New Deal art projects as a form of relief. I think that's really important because it's not a top down. It is a government program, but it comes out of agitation, and it wouldn't exist without it. Now go back to the 2 slides. This is a bit of an aside, but because Diego Rivera is a very important and iconic communist artist, I just want to say that people repeat the story of the Rockefeller thing a lot, but it's a fascinating note is that he is on this tour of the United States, and just the year before he does the Rockefeller mural, he's in Detroit doing the Detroit industry mural for Henry Ford, who was probably the most archetypal capitalist at that time. This is Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's son, that he paints into the mural. And the week that this opens, Edsel Ford, the Ford family actually is personally part of touching off one of the first big banking crises of the post 1929, the 1932 Detroit banking crisis. So you gotta feel, so I kind of have this theory that with Diego Rivera, he was like spoiling to fight when he went into, there's a reason he wanted to put Lenin in there and insist that it stayed in there. I think he was trying to get his credibility back. Tremendously volatile person. This is next slide, please. The only crowd that'll probably appreciate that he was previously he was on a tour in the first place because he was chairman of the Communist Party of Mexico, and actually excommunicated himself in 1920. And I love the idea of this quote. I, Diego Rivera, General Secretary of the Mexican Communist Party, accused the painter Diego Rivera of collaborating with the bourgeois government of Mexico and of having accepted a commission to paint the stairway of the National Palace of Mexico. This contradicts the policy of the painter Diego Rivera, the Communist Party by the General Secretary of the Communist Party. So, a big personality who brought a tremendous credibility to the United States that really inspired radical artists despite his many contradictions. So let's next one. Next one. So we've already kind of gotten into this, but I just thought it was kind of useful to think about this history as really being 2 intersecting timelines to understand what's going on. So on the one hand, you have the Communist Party's timeline. You know, they're going through a certain different line changes in relationship to things. So people have talked about the 3rd period. This is the early period, this is the early 30s period of the Communist Party policy, where they were instructed not to work with reformist unions, not to work with Democrats, to denounce them as fascist, essentially to propose that even liberal Democrats were pretty much fascists in the making. And then in 1935, as Mark and Andy talked about, there's a switch to the Popular Front, which comes out of the Soviet Union's own internal foreign policy needs. You know, they want the United States as an ally in the mounting European war that they see coming. And so they're commanded to now adapt themselves to like American conditions. And then there's this crazy swerve here when the communists briefly sign a pact with Nazi Germany, and then suddenly back to denouncing Roosevelt as an imperialist warmonger. And then in people mention the devil's bargain. In the 1940s, it's back to the Soviet Union and the United States are allies again. And the communists are very active in the war industries. They actually become some of the ones enforcing no strike pledges, you know, keeping people from striking in the war industries, and this is a big theme of the later parts of Davis's essay, Mike Davis's essay, and that really bleeds a lot of their credibility. At the same time, the New Deal arts programs come in, the New Deal goes through its own phases. It's not one thing, because Roosevelt was really moving with the wind. The first New Deal in the early parts of the 1930s is really characterized by in the arts, in terms of the art relief is built into public works of art. Because in terms of the public works programs, it's all about artists doing murals in post office buildings and so on. 1935 and 1943 is the second New Deal period, or the second New Deal period begins in 1935, and that's more about direct relief, and that is certainly for the communists. They were much more excited about that period, partly because it coincided with the Popular Front shift, but partly because it was a much more intuitive base for them amongst artists as workers. Incidentally, there was something called the Coffee Pepper Bill in 1938, which is an attempt to make a permanent New Deal, a permanent government art support for artists. Completely fails. The communists go all out to support it. It's a complete rout. And then by the end of the 1930s, the all government art support is being wound up, and to the extent that it extends, it gets rolled at the Office of War Information. It's a very narrow window when people are actively organizing around New Deal art programs. Next slide. So, I mean, I just think that we should mention this. Why are the communists like this? Why are the communists like this? Because, well, and why are the artists buying? Well, you got to imagine the October Revolution of 1917 is only 15 years in the past, in the beginning of the 1930s. Like, it's the time from now to the 2008 crisis for us. And this is a revolution that was inspiring people all around the world as an actual example that we could move beyond capitalism. Now, by the end of the 1920s, Soviet Union is a different thing. Stalin is firmly in command. The old Bolsheviks are being purged. But people still have the idea, and you can debate what kind of information they should have had access to, and there certainly were people who had critical socialists and communists who had critical line on the Communist Union, on the Soviet Union, but people still view it as the motherland of socialism. And artists specifically view it as a civilization that has moved beyond the pathologies that artists face in the capitalist art market. They view it as a civilization where artists have a respected place in society and are treated as technicians and workers, have a role in building socialism. So this would be like a cultural object you'll be familiar with from the end of the 1920s. This is Sergei Eisenstein's poster for Sergei Eisenstein's film, The General Line, which if you get a chance to watch it, you should. It's basically a piece of propaganda for the forced collectivization of agriculture, which it's sort of horrifying to think about what it's actually selling underneath the surface. But people looking at it and specifically in the context of the Dust Bowl in the United States, the collapse of agriculture, they're looking at the Soviet Union as a model for a society that works and is dealing with its problems. Next slide. So during the third period of the third period era, this is just to show the evolution of how the communists related to culture. It's a very important statement from 1932. Today, it's remembered kind of as the beginning of theorizing knowledge workers as workers, or even some people talk about it, if you're familiar with the term, the professional managerial class kind of discourse, is the communists trying to think about it. Some very important cultural figures like John Dos Passos and Langston Hughes sign this thing, and it is a theoretical statement that is a full-on denunciation of Roosevelt in 1932 in favor of the communist candidates. The Democrats in the present election have tried to appeal to both sides. Their candidate has promised as much as he safely could to as many people as he thought were influential. He has promised progressivism to progressives and conservatism to conservatives. That was the communist line on culture. Their pitched appeal to culture workers in 1952. Next slide. I'm not gonna, this is a big long block of text, but this is Andrew Hemingway from a very good essay called Cultural Democracy by Default. And he's talking about essentially how the Communist Party's cultural policy evolved with the twists and turns of Soviet foreign policy needs. So they're at the very beginning of they're very hostile to the New Deal art support. They call it an attempt to buy off the artists. And then by 1935, in the middle of the Popular Frontline, they're suddenly cautiously on board. And by the end of the decade, they are the most enthusiastic supporters of the arts projects. Next slide. So, okay, so I'm gonna, where I wanted to end this is talk about that Deadwood bargain that we came to and how this manifested in art. You know, how this evolution manifested. You know, as socialists, in theory, we're internationalists, right? The paradox of the New Deal arts projects, and specifically as they were woven in with this very strange Comintern line on it, is that they emerged with a kind of Americanism. And this idea of like, you need to merge you need to become invisible in America. You have, and that, like, they could have, like,
By invisible.
What'd you say?
What do you mean by invisible?
Well, that you shouldn't stick out as a communist. You shouldn't feel like you're speaking alien language.
Oh, I see.
You should, and which makes good sense. But in the Popular Front period, they took it really far, as we'll see. So there's this artist named Viktor Ornati, who is a refugee from Ukraine. He ends up, actually he fights in the White Army and does all this crazy stuff, but ends up in San Francisco, and where he becomes an artist and then is drawn into the Communist Party orbit. And in 1935, you have the first New Deal Arts Project, the Public Works of Art Project, the largest of these, 1934. The largest of the Public Works of Arts projects initiatives is the Coit Tower murals in San Francisco. Now, this happens to coincide with the general strike in San Francisco. 1934 is a year of general strikes, and it's actually one of the things that pushes Roosevelt to the left. Independent action of people in places like San Francisco, Minneapolis, and Toledo, really shutting things down, going to the wall. That coincides with this public art project. Viktor Ornati, who's a lefty, it has this mural in the Coit Tower, and in that mural, which is called City Life, and is supposed to be images of just ordinary people's lives in San Francisco, he has this newsstand detail where he doesn't include the conservative San Francisco paper, but he paints in the Daily Worker and the Masses, which are communist journals, and that becomes a huge scandal because the ruling class in San Francisco was freaking out about this general strike, and they're blaming it on communist outside agitators, and they're taking the opportunity to demonize the New Deal via this like commie propaganda in the mural. It happened a lot, incidentally. The criticizing the New Deal as either supporting bad art that couldn't make it on the market or supporting comedy propaganda became a really common talking point for Republicans looking to just take down all of the New Deal. It's something really to think about in terms of like how we approach ideas of government art support, because really it became the proxy for going after all the New Deal programs, the art stuff did, as good as it was. Next slide. So that's 1934, strike year, Viktor Ornati. 2 years later, in the Popular Front period, same artist paints this mural. Are people familiar with this mural? Have they heard about this controversy? No. This has been a big controversy in my little world in the last few years. It's a mural in San Francisco at George Washington High School. There's a mural that Victor Ornati was commissioned to paint in 1936. And it's about the life of George Washington. And in the last couple of years, the San Francisco City Board voted to destroy the mural because it was offensive, because of these images of, for instance, here's George Washington pointing west, and there are these settlers moving over the body of this dead Native American man. And so in the contemporary context, people look at this and view it as, a celebration of the violence of the United States. And that has touched off this huge debate about the legacy of the New Deal in the art world.
Was that meant to be celebrating it or criticizing it?
Exactly, that is exactly the question.
I mean, you
So
look
there
at
is,
it,
so art historians who studied Victor Ornati, who studied the New Deal, have fought back. That look, there's a communist artist. Look what he was doing in 1935. Look at the Communist Party's commitment to anti-racism and that Mark Naison was talking about. And so the suggestion is that there's an implied criticism here. That this was not a part of history that was normally talked about. The founding fathers, the genocide of Native peoples. There's another scene in the panel of this mural where it shows at George Washington's estate at Mount Vernon, and there are like Black slaves working in the field, and students have viewed that as celebrating that material. Critics, the defenders of the mural, say that is not material that was talked about very much.
Filled with students.
Next slide.
destroying it is like saying.
Well, ultimately, I should say, I think they voted to cover it or something like that. It will still cost $400 to cover. But in any case, Robin Kelly, who wrote the Hammer and Hoe, which we read, which was part of the suggested readings for this panel, for this section, has an article in the Nation that I thought put this very interestingly in the context of the Communist Party's Americanism. You know, I think that it's actually what it comes down to is this image is hard to read because the politics of the Communist Party at that time period were actually pretty confusing. That on the one hand, they do have a heritage of pointing out racism and organizing against it. On the other hand, under the Popular Front period, they had this ideology of Americanism. The word they would say was that communism is 20th century Americanism. And they actually tried to reclaim George Washington, Jefferson, and Thomas Paine as symbols of a native revolutionary heritage that people could hold on to. So what that produces is an image that's sort of a strange compromise that's a little bit unreadable now. So I think and then the next slide just brings us to the end of this. So I just think that is a concrete way that this legacy is sort of unresolved in the present, and some of the ways that the debates about the Popular Front and the New Deal continue to live on with us and sort of haunt the present. And that's what we think. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much. That was really great. And I just want to say a few things. So one of the things when I started was that there were still some of the people who had lived through this period alive. Okay, and they had messages for us. And so when you talk about the United Front, they always say you have to maintain independence and initiative within the United Front. That's one of the key things. You have a United Front. Sometimes it is with the Democrats, but you have to maintain your independence and initiative within it. Easier said than done in many cases. Okay, so then, as it goes on, people who started in a little collective of 6 people in Harlem are part of a worldwide movement where the Soviet Union is the bulwark against fascism, where we lost in Italy, we lost in Spain, we lost in France, we lost in Austria. They're bombing England, and there's the Soviet Union. And it's not just a line, it's a force in the world, very difficult to oppose. And within left organizations, everybody sort of goes along. Even happens within this one. There's a tendency for people to go along with the crowd. So the thing that they talked to us about, those people, was they said there were people who did a bad job of independence and initiative within the United Front. And then there were people who were careerists who thought they were going to be in the government and a big deal because they had been part of the left communist movement. They were opportunists. They were revisionists. What did they do? The first thing they did was they dissolved what they called the Negro Committee as part of the Central Committee. And they identified that moment, that action, as one of the key actions in terms of how things changed, how things went back. And they said to us, and this was a period, there was something called the Committees of Correspondence, which was a group of people who had been in, they fell out, they fell in, but they got together when the 60s started, and they started talking to each other. And you know what they came up with? They said white skin privilege is the key. The fight, and it's a new idea then. Now one of the things we're fortunate is white skin privilege is broadly understood now. That was an idea 30 people were debating that. So it's a very different situation. So anyways, I just want to say that these struggles and the things we can learn from them are central for us. Because the same kinds of things are happening today. The anti-woke movement. It's the same thing. They're trying to, vilify a whole movement that's going on. They're finding a way. Are we defending that enough? I don't think we are. We're not attacking those people enough. They're closing libraries. These are lessons we have to learn and hang on to. It's not a question of line, it's a question of what you do. That's all.
Yeah, just to add on to that, just the Dorothy Healy biography, and that was part of the standard readings, is a really good account of what it felt like to live through. It's like navigating these things as a person inside.
I wanted to add to your comment briefly, if that's okay. Just when you said that, yeah, the attitude of the Popular Front was, I'm taking the bait and doing the most controversial. The attitude of the Popular Front was like much more easily said than done. Sure, seems true, but I would also add that it wasn't even easy to say. Right, it had to be said under a lot of necessity, right? And maybe we need to think about how much that applies to us, right?
We're a half hour over. I'm sorry about that. We want to do one more question or one more comment, and then we can just hang out, or
Announcements.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated like how you kind of ended this with talk about like how the Popular Front affected like communist conception of American history. I'm just curious, like, what was because right now, like, we're still kind of going through that debate of like what was the significance of like the American Revolution? Like, was it a progressive event or not? When for the Communist Party, like what was their position before they had this shift of what America was, you know?
I don't know, someone that might be able to speak better than, I mean, my impression is that this was like a project of like coming up with an idiom through which they could like claim Americanism, which was a part of the mainstream Marxistic and cultural conversation as a communist thing. What it was, what the I literally do not know how people talked about the Revolutionary War in like 1920s communist schools. Yeah, Jeremy. Right?
I mean, I presume that it was a bourgeois revolution, right? So, I mean, it'd be a little different. Maybe like the kinds of criticisms we are more
It's like whether
likely
they
to
were
say
really sharp on
immediately
race,
now.
I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. I think it would just be like, these were bourgeoisie, they were fighting for, you know, liberal civil rights. That was like a step in the way to progress, but we left it behind. Like, I think that would have been the vibe before the Popular Front, when it's a little more emphasizing like the more seemingly, you know, certain like more left-wing parts of that period, like, you know, agrarian radical like Amy Jefferson or like Lincoln and the ending of slavery. But those are parts now that we are much less comfortable about because of the, you know, questions of slavery that were found out in the very beginning.
Yeah.
Outside of Native Americans.
We have the benefit of a lot of radical stuff. Like Linda Joy, right? Black Reconstruction. I think that there's like actual projects of reclaiming this history that took place. And I just, you know, I'm not. But a really good question for us to keep talking about. Thank you to everybody for your patience. Further announcements before we go.
I think I'm making some announcements. Do we have an announcements slide or should I just?
I don't think we have an announcement slide, sorry.
Okay, no worries. So hi, I'm Jeremy, one of the co-chairs of NYC DSA. Thanks, everybody. Just really quick before we put chairs away. Political education events that do cost a little money to put on. We ask if we're gonna pass around a bicycle helmet. So if you have, you know, $5, please put it in. It lets us do big, ambitious, cool events. Also Harrington, who just went to get said bicycle helmet, is our treasurer. So if you can Venmo her, she can also tell you her Venmo.
She can meet you at
Oh, good idea. I like that.
You can just stand by the door.
I like that.
I'll stand at the door.
And then second of all, we have a May Day block party coming up on Sunday. We're gonna take over, it's an open street, so we're gonna be on the street in front of this office. It's gonna be barbecue and celebrating workers and all that, so good stuff. And come back in 2 weeks for our next night school, which is on McCarthyism and the suppression of the American left in the 50s. So kind of following this historical story, the American Socialists that we've been doing this semester. And just finally, a last note, you know, Harry Belafonte died today, great civil rights musician and activist. And a socialist and a student of Paul Robeson that was mentioned today. So just if everybody, you know, I think it's worth just like taking a second to remember that part of the struggle. In a month, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. So just, you know, here's to you, Harry Belafonte, and to your place in the movement. And let's continue that work.
New York City DSA political education. We always welcome people with ideas that you'd like to work on. Any of the people who've been talking.
We're moving the chair.
Thanks for coming, everyone, and yeah, please come 2 weeks from now. If you didn't hear, we're going to be talking about McCarthyism. It's where I think some of the tensions mentioned kind of come into